Very quickly, because I want to get into the business of the session, I want to go backwards to the election. I want to ask you all why you decided to run, and if there was one thing from an issue set standpoint that motivated you to run. Ms. Bowers, you had run previously.
Yes.
And let me point out that when you ran previously against the incumbent, and it was an incumbent, and it's hard to beat an incumbent, the incumbent Republican beat you last time by 10 points.
Correct.
You beat the Republican challenger by 10 points this
Yes.
time. There was a 20-point swing
in
that district.
Absolutely.
I know you thought you'd win, but did you think there would be a 20-point swing? What an election cycle.
This go round?
Sure. From this go round to last. I mean, that's pretty significant.
Well, obviously I thought I would win, absolutely. Right. And both times I thought I would win.
Did you? Well, you were 1 for 2.
Yes, yes. Thank goodness. And some of my colleagues, I'm, just impressed with them to go out first time and win the first time. But, first time against the incumbent, it was a David and Goliath moment. It really was.
Right.
And I was told over and over again, you're crazy in the district that I represent now. And good luck. They'd look at me and just like, really, that's what you're trying to do? But after we did so well the first go round, I thought, there's no way. I mean, I went to our neighborhood Targets and our neighborhood Walmart, and so many people were like, I voted for you.
You heard people open to the idea of considering a change.
Absolutely.
Right.
And a lot of those people, Evan, were not Democrats.
Right.
So I think, as you mentioned, this...
Do you think they were voting, Representative, do you think they were voting for something in your case or against something? I know that they were voting for you in a literal sense, but when you hear people talking about considering a change in the party controlling the seat, was it as much affirmative voting for something or negative voting against something?
I want to believe that it was more affirmative, but it absolutely was a little bit of both.
Right.
In 2016, I set out and ran a campaign that was trying to create change. And so that is what we ran on. That is what we pushed even into 2018.
Set the table for this race.
Absolutely.
Mr. Talarico, you also won a seat that had been held by the other party, and the margins were not quite as great this time. It wasn't a 10-point race. In your case, it was about 3.5 points. But I noticed that Mr. Gonzalez last time didn't even have a Democratic opponent. And the last time a Democrat ran, which was the cycle before that, that Democrat didn't even crack 40%. So again, something seems to have happened. I joke that the mayor of Austin, Steve Adler, has made this city so unaffordable to live in that he's pushed people with Austin values and Austin votes into Williamson County. So ultimately, you should send him Tiff's treats. Thank him for the, right?
Yeah, I mean,
sort of.
I think in Williamson County, people value responsibility and community and pragmatism, and those are all things that are missing in our politics today. So like Representative Bowers said, I think there's something broken in our political system, and people are looking to return to some kind of common sense, common decency.
You ran on pragmatism. How boring.
It was a pretty, I would say, a boring campaign. And I was lucky, we had an open seat, and we had a really wonderful Republican opponent that I ran against, and we had, I think, a really classy campaign between the two of us, and we ran on ideas and policy, and I wish every district could have the same kind of election.
You had run an education nonprofit, and you'd been a public school teacher, and you ended up on public education, which I'm guessing is not an accident. This is an issue you care a lot about.
Right, and
that was a motivator for you to run.
Absolutely. When I left the class, I taught on the west side of San Antonio and San Antonio ISD, and when I left the classroom on the last day of school, I promised my students that I would fight for them every single day of my life. And when I got my master's in education policy, when I led a local nonprofit, and when I ran for office, it was all based on that promise. And now, as a member of the Public Education Committee, I can elevate their voices and their stories to another level, and hopefully help students just like them across the state. And I would credit Speaker Bonin for putting a Democrat in a swing seat on a really important committee like Public Ed is not easy for him to do. But I think he wants practitioners, he wants people with classroom experience.
Subject matter experts.
Right. And so he's putting kids over politics, which is huge.
Representative Gonzalez, it's hard to beat the other party, but it's nervy to beat your own party. And this was an election cycle where all over the country we saw upstart Democrats deciding that the person who had that seat from their party was simply not representing the district with enough enthusiasm, energy, or progressivism. You made a decision to challenge somebody who, in the minds of at least some people, was doing a fine enough job in that seat. But obviously enough people thought, nope, it's time for change.
Yes. I mean, we could always do better. And the people deserve to have their representative. They deserve to have their voice being heard in Austin through their elected official. That wasn't happening in my district. My predecessor had been there for about 26 years. And I think the people were just ready for a change. You know, and as somebody who, excuse me, who was born and raised in the district,
right.
who has, you know, I have my law firm there. I wanted somebody who's going to stand up and fight for the people of the district, and also somebody who's going to stand up and fight for our democratic values. And that simply just wasn't happening there.
So I refer to change that may have come in Ms. Bowers' district or change that may have come in Mr. Talarico's district. Your district, from an ideology standpoint, has remained fairly consistent, but I wonder if the generational change, I mean, you're talking about Mr. Alonso having been there for 26 years. The voters in this district today are different voters than the voters 26 years ago who first elected him. So has there been a change, at least in the mindset within the party, about what they want out of the person in that seat, as you were able to see it?
As a party?
I mean, generationally. Is there generational change that has caused the constituents of that district to think differently about what they want from their representative?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, there's several areas of my district that are gentrifying.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's completely different. I mean, it's
right.
younger, it's more progressive. And really, the people of the district, they want somebody who is going to fight for them, who's going to at least make some noise, right? And it's a very safe democracy.
Lose some fights, but lose them noisily on behalf of the district.
Yes.
If that's what it takes.
And that seat can deserve, I mean, it can do that.
Right, right. Mr. Talarico, I want to start on our discussion of the 86 by asking you about the tone of the place. You know, we in the press have been prone to complain. I certainly have been prone to complain about how, speaking of boring, about how boring this session has been so far. You all are getting along. The House and the Senate are getting along. For you, that's a good thing. For me, maybe that's a bad thing.
Sure.
Is the tone of the place inside when we're not looking at you, when you're behind closed doors, the same as it's been publicly?
I think so. Again, this is my first session, so I don't have much to compare it to.
Right.
But I think when you say that it's boring, it may not be good for the media, but I think it's good for the people of Texas.
Yeah.
I think one of the things when I was knocking, I knocked on 5,000 doors in my district, and I feel like what they wanted most was like to never hear about me after they voted for me, right? They wanted me to go do the job, not bother them, and make their lives a little easier. And so I think it's a good thing for everybody in the state when we're not focused on bathrooms, we're not focused on guns, right. We're focused on school finance and property taxes.
Right. But Ms. Bowers, you know, the fact is elections have consequences, and the electorate last time sent a bunch of people to Austin who believed that it was in fact their job to talk about those sharp objects on the table, bathrooms and sanctuary cities,
sure.
vouchers, guns. Mm-hmm. So what changed? And I would say the same thing, I would ask you the same thing I asked Ms. Talarico. Are you hearing inside the building where we're not looking at you the same kind of let's all get along, stick to business tone that we're hearing outside?
Absolutely. I think we're all hopeful that the speaker's message, that he set the tone like right away during freshman orientation. The message of unity, the message that the House is one body. He set that tone. We all embraced it as freshmen, and I think whether we're on the floor or in the halls, we're checking on each other. We are just kind of like, how was your weekend? How are you balancing this? How's your family? And then, are you filing any bills? We're checking on each other across.
You're treating each other as humans first and as colleagues in the legislature second.
Absolutely.
What a novel idea, right?
Right.
The humanity of that place is not something I'm used to hearing about up here on stage. Mm-hmm. Representative Gonzalez, I wonder how you felt about the tone in the building. You know, I remember when then Representative Chairman Bonin had his press conference a couple days after Election Day to declare the war over and that he had won. Mm-hmm. There was not yet sworn in Representative Bowers standing right behind him, and I thought, who's that?
Yes.
You were not there behind him.
I was not.
Yes. Are you behind him now in the metaphysical sense?
I support him in having a bipartisan House.
Right. You think he's put together, at least from a leadership standpoint, chairmanships and everything else, a bipartisan House?
Yes, I mean, I feel that he did appoint several Democrats to leadership positions within, important committees.
I think there were 12 committee chairs, kind of roughly equivalent, given the fact that the number of committees is not the same to Strauss. I mean, he's still playing that by the usual tradition, right?
And I remain optimistic that it's going to continue that way through session. everybody has been really friendly and very open to working together across the aisle. And so I hope that that we're able to stick to that, we're able to work on the important issues.
But the disagreements will come, because they always come.
Absolutely.
And the question is, when they come, that's when you will be able to test the theory of the Bonin case.
Yes.
Right? This is a guy who famously knows how to make a fist. The question is which direction he shakes it in. Right? Are you confident that you can work with him even at the time that you disagree with him based on what you've seen?
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, if some of these issues come up and we get derailed from the real issues, like public education, property taxes.
Right.
I think that Democrats are going to be prepared to fight back.
Right. Mr. Talarico, I want to talk about one interesting aspect of the legislature after this election. It is a much more diverse legislature today compared to previously. Now, let's not get crazy and say that it's a diverse legislature. It's a more diverse legislature. This is still not a legislature that looks like the state it's governing, but you're 29 years old. As I said on Twitter after you were elected, Tom Craddock had been in the legislature for 21 years when you were born.
It's also the last time we updated the cost of education index, too.
I like mine better, but that's pretty good.
Thank you.
That's pretty good.
Thank you.
I have a feeling you showed up with that one in your holster with the safety off. I think that's what you... But so you are one of several members of the legislature who are younger rather than older. What is having somebody your age or your generation, what does that do to your perspective on the issues that you have to deal with in this building?
It's one of the things I'm most excited about, especially in the Democratic caucus, like you see on this stage. We look like Texas in our caucus. We have diverse identities, whether it's race or gender or sexual orientation or age. And I think it's, I feel pressure to represent my generation at the table. There aren't nearly enough millennials in the state capitol when our generation has the most to lose in most of these discussions.
Well, and the fact is, by 2022, 1 out of 3 voters in Texas, the next gubernatorial race, the next statewide elections, 1 out of 3 voters in Texas is going to be under 30.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? So the question of millennials being a force in this state has already been litigated and resolved, right? So do you look at those issues, do you look at the issues that you'll deal with, public schools, property taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, differently by virtue of being 29 as opposed to, say, 49?
Yeah, I feel like our generation, of course, kind of came of age with September 11th terrorist attacks and the Great Recession, and there's been a lot written about kind of our generation's orientation towards service and serving our country, our state, our community, and trying to put aside some of the more polarizing aspects of politics.
Well, and in fact, Mr. Talarico, just to stay on that for a second, one of the things that's said about your generation is that you are post-everything. You're post-gay, you're post-racial, you're post, blank, 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 blank. Basically, that your generation takes the position on a lot of these issues, why are we fighting about this? Just stop, and then move on to other stuff.
Sure.
Is that a fair characterization of what you think?
I mean, our generation is the most connected, empathetic, diverse generation that this country has ever seen. And so I think that attitude is born out of our characteristics.
So by virtue of that, you have to look at these issues differently.
I think so, and I think you see that not only in kind of the way I run my campaign, but John Busey and Aaron Zwiener and the other kind of 30-somethings that have just become elected. We just started rejuvenating the Youth Caucus. I think it was yesterday we elected John as our chair, and so I'm hoping we can organize not just within the Democratic caucus, but with our youth members on the other side of the aisle as well.
Right. Ms. Bowers, the state of Texas is 57% citizens of color. Okay. The legislature is not 57% members of color. It's about half as diverse as the state it serves. It's a little bit like looking at the State of the Union, looking at the audience of the State of the Union the other day. It was really quite remarkable. The most interesting color I saw out in the audience in the State of the Union was white, as in all those people wearing white. But then the second most interesting color was everything else, because all of a sudden, it was a much more diverse assemblage, at least on one side. And I have to say that when you look at we did a graphic of all the new members of the legislature, 27 new members, 17 Democrats and 10 Republicans. They did not look the same.
No.
The Democrats elected this time were much more diverse and much more representative if you just look at the statistics. What does having more legislators of color mean to this portfolio of issues that you all are going to deal with in this session?
Well, it actually means that we will speak and we will be a voice for the people in our communities, whether that's in healthcare or the need for the investment in education or jobs. You know, on the campaign trail, we talked a lot about how we're educating our seniors and getting them through higher education, making sure that's affordable. So we're going to speak for those, at those voices. You know, the people of color that are in the legislature will definitely be voices, but we're going to have a tough job because there are not that many of us, as you said. I mean, there are only 9, 2 of which are freshmen, African-American elected females in the Texas legislature. So we have had to band together, and we saw that early on. There is the more senior members, of course, Ms. T, affectionately, Symphonia Thompson, and Dr. Alma Allen, Yvonne Davis, they all rallied around. And I think...
And they've been there long enough that they have seniority, but they also have a sense of how to work the levers, right? They know how the place works.
Yes.
Yeah, so they can guide you guys on how to work the place.
And they absolutely have been. So I think what they told us, Evan, is that we brought some energy, some different kind of energy, and I think that's across the board, whether it's people of color or the diversity that our class has brought on the Democratic side.
Representative Gonzalez, 2 things to you on this point. One is, just as the population of the state is significantly more citizens of color than the legislature represented, half the population of Texas is women. The legislature is not nearly half women. In fact, in the history of Texas, we haven't elected enough women to the legislature to fill the seats in one legislature, right? But there are more women this time. Mm-hmm. So again, I'll say the same to you. What do you think having more women in the legislature will do to the set of issues that you all will litigate this session?
We bring a different perspective to the table. And the more women that we have at the table, we're able to advocate for issues that are important, to women. But we shouldn't limit those issues to only like reproductive right issues, right? Every issue is a woman's issue, and so having more people of color, having a more diverse legislature, we're able to have a robust conversation, and talk about some of these issues that are going to affect everybody in Texas.
Yeah, and I'll note, as one of 4 openly gay members of the legislature this time, you now have an LGBTQ caucus that has enough members to elect 4 officers. Right? Everybody gets to be an officer. It's like middle school field day, right? Everybody gets a ribbon. But that aspect of diversity is also progress from where it had been previously. And while it does not mirror the percentage of the population that may be in the LGBTQ community, nonetheless, that also represents a different legislature than in previous legislatures. Mm-hmm. Right. So let's dive into issues here. So yesterday we had a marathon hearing, 15 hours on the Senate side about the property tax bill. To refresh the memories of people in the room, and for all of you who were not in the building before, we ended the last season of the TV series with a cliffhanger, right? House was at 6%, Senate was at 4%. They couldn't come to an agreement. Governor came back around and said 2.5%. Mm-hmm. And as Senator Betancourt told me the other day, when we got back into the session this time, they agreed to take the governor's number. We're going to sort of split the difference at 2.5%. That's the starting point. Mm-hmm. Mr. Talarico, is that plan a good plan or a bad plan to require that local officials go back to the voters if the increase is 2.5% or more? Good or bad?
It's a bad plan.
It's a bad plan. Why?
Well, I mean, it's a solution in search of a problem. We have a way of capping property taxes in this state, and they're called elections. When people in any given community feel like they're not being represented by their elected officials or their government entity, they have a way of resolving that through the democratic process. It's kind of strange as Democrats to be talking about local control, right? I look across the aisle to my Republican opponents, I'm like, this used to be y'all's song.
That used to be the conservative idea, right?
Sure,
yeah.
Right. And so I ran as a pro-city candidate. We're a fast growth area in Williamson County, and we have a lot of needs with a booming population. And for the state to handcuff our local officials and decide what we need for ourselves, I think goes directly against the idea of local.
So Betancourt, if Betancourt were here, what he would say to you is, first of all, we're not handcuffing local officials. All we're saying is if you want to raise taxes, hell, raise them by 25%. Just go to the voters and ask them if that's okay. Why can't you just do that? Why do you hate democracy?
Yeah, elected officials go to the voters every time they're up for election.
Right.
Right? And so you're adding another layer of difficulty onto local decision making.
But your property values in Williamson County are going up, are they not?
Sure.
Right.
And
so aren't your voters feeling the pinch?
Absolutely, but the voters in Williamson County are pretty astute, and they know the reason their property taxes are going up is because we have a broken school finance system, and that the greatest driver of property tax growth is your school bill, right? I mean, so that's when I say it's a solution in search of a problem, I mean that your cities are not the culprits when it comes to rising property taxes.
Mr. Talarico, technically, isn't it the inverse? Isn't it the case that the local rates get set first and the state comes in behind the locals?
For school.
So it's not that the state is not funding enough of public ed and therefore your school taxes go up. Really, the state is off the hook because your school taxes go up.
So, right. So school finance is obviously a passion of mine.
Yeah.
And when the state sets your school entitlement, you start with that basic allotment and it gets adjusted based on school characteristics, students' characteristics, and district characteristics.
Right.
And the first thing that goes into that pot is revenue from your local property taxes. And as values rise across the state, that fills more and more of your pot. And then when the state aid gets added, obviously some districts overflow their pot, and that gets sent back through recapture. And so I think the solution that we've been talking about throughout the building is a pretty simple one to that problem of recapture, which is just increasing that basic allotment so that folks across the state can keep more of their local revenue in their local schools.
Right. Ms. Bowers, in your district, are you hearing about property taxes when you go back home?
Absolutely.
Did you hear about it during the campaign?
We absolutely did.
So are you for the bill?
For the 2.5?
For the 2.5?
Absolutely not.
Because?
Because I believe we do have to invest in education, just to make sure. That's where I believe the relief is going to come from. Once we put the proper money in our schools and invest in our students, and as Representative Talarico said, we have to believe in local control. We have to know.
Yeah, is the problem the 2.5%? Would there be a higher number that you would be okay with? I mean, right now the law is 8%. So would you be more comfortable with 5? Would you be good with 5, or is the issue any restraint on local officials to raise revenue at all?
I think it is that. I think we don't need to put the restraints on our local officials. I think we've got to just find a way to funnel more funding into our schools, and I do believe that the relief will come to our citizens on how much they're investing. I had seniors, and when you look at my district, it is a little more seasoned, and so we have seniors that are living on fixed incomes, and they're like, we paid into the property taxes. We paid for the schools when our kids were in school. And we didn't mind paying after they were out of school. But at this point, they're on fixed income, so it's tough for them to keep up with the property taxes.
Ms. Gonzalez, aren't we fixing the wrong problem here? Isn't the problem not property tax rates, but appraisal districts, appraisal rates, and the fact that we have 254 different ways of calculating appraisals, and that the better solution to the problem here would be to get a handle on appraisals rather than property taxes?
That is one of the issues. We need to make sure that we have a consistent way of providing appraisals, that people are reporting, certain sales of like commercial property, so that those are being taxed adequately, and also tied with funding public education as well. We should not dictate what local government or how they should run the show over there. They're the ones that deal with.
So the principle of local control, you want to let everybody do their own thing. And then voters, as Mr. Talarico says, will take care of it in the end by deciding if they like those local officials and how they act, then they'll re-elect them. If they don't like them, they'll defeat them.
Yes.
Right? You mentioned the commercial and appraisals. That's been an interesting point. It's always an interesting point, especially at election time. Mm-hmm. I heard Democratic candidates, particularly in the last election cycle, say, honestly, commercial and industrial property owners are getting a significant break from the state in terms of the appraisals set and the taxes they're paying, and that if they simply paid their fair share, there's as much as $5 billion available that could go to public education or something else. You believe that's true?
Yes.
So you want to raise the taxes of business owners?
Well, I know one of the concerns is that the sale prices aren't being reported.
Reported accurately.
Yes.
So
yes.
Truth in appraisals. Truth in Mr. Talarico, you understand that that's going to be the trap that, as I just, in a very nice way for Representative Gonzalez, as I said, a little bit of a trap. That's the trap that is going to be set for anybody who talks about truth in appraisals, is that really what you call truth in appraisals, civilians call a tax increase.
Sure, and there's always this game politicians play where they're trying to skirt around the label of a tax increase, and it's closing a loophole or paying their fair share. I mean, I don't want to play games with the people in my district. When it comes to an appraisal district, they've got to scrounge around to find what the market value is for any given property, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial. And so most states, as folks in this room know, have sales price disclosure, where the price of that sale is publicly available. And I know in Texas we're concerned about privacy and all those things, but I think there's a compromise here where you could disclose that sales price directly to the appraisal district. So it's not a public disclosure, but that way the appraisal district, who doesn't, I mean, at least in Williamson County, we set the standard in terms of best practices for our appraisal district, and they're just trying to assess the accurate value of a property. Whether how it gets taxed is up to elected officials. And so these are kind of the refs in this game, and we're really preventing them from getting accurate data to allow us to collect revenue from across our community. And so I would be in favor of some kind of sales price disclosure system, and whether it's public or just directly to appraisal districts. I think it could help make sure everybody's paying their fair share.
Let me ask the three of you as Democrats, as members of the Democratic Caucus, the broad Democratic Caucus, whether you think you could hold together as a caucus on this issue. I went back and looked at how the Senate in particular last time voted on this. Last time when the Senate's plan to take it down to 4% was ultimately passed by the Senate, again, nothing ever moved beyond that. It was a vote of 1912. It was 2011 Republican and Democrat at the time. Senator Seliger, the most powerful man in Texas now, voted against that bill. He is a former mayor of Amarillo, and he voted more as a mayor than as a senator, right? So he opposed that bill. So all 12 Democrats, all 11 Democrats, pardon me, held together, and Senator Seliger joined them. This time, the Republicans have 19, which is why Seliger is so important. If he decides to bail, they can't bring a bill to the floor if all Democrats hold together. All Democrats holding together has an impact. Do you get a sense, Ms. Gonzalez, from the Democratic Caucus that there's unanimity in the caucus about not supporting this legislation?
I believe so. Excuse me, I think that voters sent a message this last cycle, and they really want to see everybody working on the real issues. And so,
you don't think property tax is a real issue?
Absolutely, I do.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the top issues in my district.
Right.
And I'm optimistic that we will be able to stay on track, and we won't get derailed by the rhetoric that we saw last session.
Right. Ms. Bowers, you have worked part-time in education in your district. You understand the challenges educators face. What is the number? Give me a specific number. No getting off the hook here. How much money should go into public education this session? And I'm not just talking about, by the way, the rebalancing of the seesaw. Sure. Because there is this sense that the property taxes paid by local folks will go down, the state's share will go up. Right now it's in the mid-30s, so it'll go up somewhere. But the concern in some quarters is that it will be a wash for public education. So I want to know, over and above the rebalancing, how much money should go into public education specifically?
Well, you would ask me that.
Yes, I would.
But, and I'll say, in 16, we tried to find the funding, as a candidate. We were digging and trying to find it. In 18, we looked back at the 85th legislative session and HB 21 and where the House and the Senate, what the House sent to the Senate.
Right.
And so I think in giving you a number, I can only say we go back to exactly where they left off. And we build from there.
That was $1.5 billion to start. That's the foundation.
Yeah, so I think we build from there because that was a number that the House that we had agreed upon.
Right.
And I think if we start there, we're going to have to possibly add to that. But I just think that if that's a good starting place for us.
Ms. Gonzalez, the base budget in the House is how much? $7 billion for education? I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot more than that 1.5. Senate said, I think the Senate's base budget was 3.7. So you're off to a start, but you're not in alignment yet. What do you think the number is specifically?
If we knew the number, we would have resolved this issue a long time ago.
It's complicated.
Yes, and I think that there are several factors that play into it.
Yeah.
As far as, like we look at some of the weights that are being used, right, to determine how much money is going to be allotted to a certain district, a certain school district.
Right.
Those need to be revisited for us to be able to make that determination of, what money goes where. But, I believe that, every child deserves a quality education.
Yeah.
So whatever it takes. I mean, whatever it takes for us to assure that every child in Texas, regardless of where you live, the color of your skin, that you're going to get the education that you deserve.
You get, does your gut tell you, Representative Gonzalez, that there's enough money in the budget, as the comptroller has explained, the revenue available to you, what you know of the budget as it breaks down? There's so much that's already pre-spent for you when you show up that you don't have a lot of discretion. But do you have a sense that there's enough money in the budget currently to spend on public ed? Or are there things that you think you'll have to stop doing in order to start doing more on public ed? Addition through subtraction.
I think we're going to I don't know what happened. Try to find the money.
Yeah.
You know, again, you know, I believe that voters send a message that this is the top issue, and they want to see us working on it.
So it's not like it's just
we gotta
sitting
figure
over
it
here
out.
waiting to be spent. You may have to go looking for it, but you think in the end it'll probably be there.
That seems to be the top priority for everybody in the House.
Right.
You know, Republicans and Democrats.
Mr. Talarico, you're on the Public Ed Committee. Chair Huberty said the other day he didn't think we'd have a bill till the end of the month, but jump out in line ahead of him and tell me what you're going to do. What's the number?
Okay, so yeah, let's fix it here in the room.
Good.
So
I like your can-do spirit.
that's right. So obviously, I think when we talk about increasing education funding, you know, whether we're building into the formula or doing a one-time infusion of dollars are two different things. And so what I'm most excited about from the School Finance Commission's recommendations is building into the formula some of these initiatives to really improve education outcomes across the state. So I would say there's three primary problems with our school finance system. One is recapture, which we mentioned earlier, which, you know, to me, there's a relatively simple fix, and simple in school finance terms is not always
still
simple.
hard,
But
right, yeah.
But increasing the basic allotment, allowing folks to keep more of their local tax revenues, I think is something that'll alleviate the pressures of recapture. So that's one problem. It's usually the most high-profile problem too, because it's so tangible for communities to say, like, that's our money, it's going somewhere else. Why is that, right? Although this is probably not a good thing to say, but I'm a fan of recapture in theory. And actually, Texas was pretty progressive in this country for starting a system like that, and has kept our districts relatively equitable in terms of funding. So I think.
And by the way, there is some irony. You know, Austin complains all the time about its recapture payment. Austin presumes itself to be the most progressive city in the world, except when it comes to helping the least of us elsewhere in the state with our money. Then suddenly we're like, no, thank you.
Well, I mean, so speaking of Austin, so that leads us to the second problem, which is in terms what Representative Gonzalez just spoke to, which is kind of the formula itself needing updating in terms of district characteristics and student characteristics. And, you know, we heard yesterday that the Legislative Budget Board is required by statute to review the Cost of Education Index, and they came to us 2 meetings ago and said, we can't even update it because the thing is so screwed up.
Doesn't the School Finance Commission report call for that thing to be obliterated? Anyway.
Well, and reallocated.
Reallocated, right, yeah.
So, you know, updating, so, you know, things like increasing student weights for comp ed, for eco-dis, for special education, English language learners, you know, those things are going to help, and eliminating things like the CEI will help in terms of updating the formula itself.
Right.
And then the last, which is where I think there's going to be the most conversation and the most disagreement, is in terms of improving outcomes in this state. Which is, I mean, we can talk about finances, recapture, and the formula, but whether or not we're going to improve public education for our students is a different matter entirely.
And what metric, Mr. Talarico, because I know this is not an inconsequential question, what metric for success do you apply in that case? How do you determine whether an outcome is the outcome you want?
So are you talking about student outcomes?
Well, I know that there was a brief discussion for a moment that maybe high-stakes testing would make an unheralded return to all of our communities, but the speaker has scotched that. So in the absence of that, what are the metrics?
So, I mean, every teacher will tell you, any educator will tell you that assessment is a necessary part of teaching and learning. What that assessment looks like is going to be something that we debate. I have a lot of concerns about the STAR test itself, but it's the only game in town in Texas. And so currently, I mean, we have to have assessment, we have to have data to know if students are learning and to know where to redirect our resources. I think every educator will agree with that. You do it in your classroom every single day if you're an effective educator, is check for understanding. And so, you know, the STAR test itself has problems. The stakes attached to standardized testing is a problem. But assessment has to be the way that we know what's working and what's not working.
So we don't know what it's going to be yet.
We don't know what.
We don't know what the particular metric of assessment will be as it ties back to funding. We haven't determined that.
Right.
Yet.
But I think, I mean, everybody should be. I'm always blown away that every day in this building we don't talk about the fact that a majority of third graders in this state can't read. A majority of third graders in this state don't meet reading standards by the end of third grade. And third grade is critical for educators in the room because that's when you stop learning to read and you read to learn, right? And so why that's not the headline every single day we walk into this building, I don't know. But the focus by the commission on those early grade bands, pre-K through third grade, I think is the right step. Now, whether we're going to tie funding directly to those test scores is different, and whether or not we're going to have a runway for districts in year 1 and year 2 to build up to that accountability system is also something that I'm interested in.
Ms. Gonzalez, on that subject, a couple sessions in a row, the governor made pre-K an emergency item. This time not. And even when it was an emergency item, the legislature couldn't get its act together in terms of funding pre-K adequately or making the decision to go from half-day to full day pre-K. Even the state of Oklahoma, which we mock all the time, made the decision longer ago that half-day was not adequate and went to full day. Right? If Oklahoma is willing to do full day, how are we allowing ourselves to be behind Oklahoma? I will remind you, OU sucks, as I'm obligated to say at all moments. So where's pre-K in this conversation?
Well, let's just start with saying there was how many emergency items?
6. I think there were 5 or 6. I mean, some of them were like kind of connected together, so it's hard to disengage them, but sort of 5 or 6.
We just have to continue fighting on making sure that we're fully funding pre-K.
Let me maybe ask the question this way, reverse engineer it. Is any school finance solution that does not include full day pre-K and adequate funding for it going to get through this legislature? How optimistic are you that this is going to be part of the answer?
I'm always optimistic. I want to remain optimistic.
Yeah, but temper that with realism.
Yes. If it doesn't include it, then we're going to have to push back on that. I mean, we have to make sure that we're adequately funding.
So you're on team pre-K?
Yes, absolutely.
Ms. Bowers?
Absolutely, team pre-K. I have 2 students in my household, one that's still there. She's a senior, and I can tell you, looking at the 2 of the 3 of our kids, the middle child, our son, they're all great students. However, he did half-day pre-K. And by first grade, kindergarten and first grade, he was struggling with reading. We looked at that, and he per se was our guinea pig. His sister came behind him. She was in a much longer day pre-K, and she fared better.
You're the proof that this is how this goes.
Absolutely.
Right. Mr. Talarico, you've been a teacher. You know that there are good teachers, there are mediocre teachers, and there are bad teachers. And let me right away say there are good journalists, there are mediocre journalists, and there are bad journalists. That's exactly right. Why is the Senate-based budget mandating a $5,000 pay increase for every single teacher? Good teachers, mediocre teachers, and bad teachers. Why would we spend money on bad teachers?
This is the thing I'm most excited about this session. Before that, I just want to say about pre-K. There are some folks who, I think this is the problem with not having educators in this building, who look at half-day and full day, and they say, actually, the difference between the 2, the instructional hours are the same, you're just adding more recess and a nap, and every early childhood educator will tell you that recess and play and rest are all part of a child's learning at that age. And whether you're developing fine motor skills, gross motor skills, social emotional learning, all that happens when you have full day pre-K as opposed to half day. Again, that's the difference between having a lawyer make these decisions and having an educator
Stop
make these
being
decisions.
knowledgeable, Mr. Taylor.
Okay. So
Representative Stickland says that all you're doing is taking kids out of the hands of their parents, who are in the much better position to get these kids ready for the world than schools are.
Early childhood is prime time in terms of a child's development. I think it's 700 neuron connections are made every second. That's when intelligence itself is being developed. And so I actually think the discussion nationwide has moved beyond pre-K, and it's actually going from 0 to 3 is really where we should be focused on. Texas is behind the curve.
Give me a quick one on teacher pay. What about that?
Again, treating teachers like workers on an assembly line, treating us equally, is part of what undermines the respect, prestige, support, compensation of educators, and has since the beginning. And so I'm concerned about using standardized test scores to judge a teacher's performance, but that doesn't mean there aren't other ways. In fact, the most statistically significant indicator of a teacher performance is student evaluations. Students know who the best teachers are and who aren't. And so, Dallas ISD has obviously done important work on this area of strategic compensation, and I hope we can adopt something that gives districts flexibility to build something from the ground up, an evaluation system to identify most effective educators, and then pay them accordingly. Like you said, every other profession does this.
But
I don't know why teachers are not
simply do a
exempt.
blanket. You would not be for a blanket pay increase.
I mean, sure, I think teachers across the board should be paid more. But no, what I'm more interested in is paying teachers based on the quality of their teaching.
Outcomes-based pay.
Sure.
In that respect.
Right.
Let me ask you about, Ms. Gonzalez, about the border and immigration. You worked in the White House for a while, and you actually worked on the immigration. This is an issue you know well, on a whole host of aspects of it.
Yes, on the policy side, yeah.
On the policy side. We have funded border security to the tune of $800 million in the state budget each of the last 2 budget cycles. I heard when that appropriation originally happened that the problem was the federal government was not taking responsibility for this issue. We are still paying $800 million every 2 years for border security. I did not hear a lot about border security in the state of the state, heard a little bit more about it in the State of the Union, but really we haven't been talking too much about that in this session. I know and you know it's going to come back up around again, the question of the appropriation. Will we be talking about it, and in what way, and what should we do about the appropriation that we've put in there in the last 2 times?
I mean, it needs to remain a federal issue. But, you know, Representative Narvaez is head of the Homeland Security Committee, and so I think that he is going to definitely fight to make sure that, you know, that we're using funds appropriately. We need to focus more on, instead of funding for some kind of border wall, we need to focus on safety, right? And in reality, I mean, you know, we heard recently that there were, you know, referencing El Paso as being, you know, a really dangerous city. I mean, these are...
Right, that rally next week is going to be lit, isn't it, in El Paso?
Yeah. And I just think that, you know, that fear is being instilled in folks that really they shouldn't have.
Right. So you don't think this is going to come back? I mean, to my mind,
optimism.
Well, but Representative, I read the room. Not this room, but that room,
yes.
right? I read that room, and I think there's no way in hell they're going to cut that border security appropriation. There's not a chance. But you all intend to make it an argument nonetheless.
If it comes back up, yes.
Right. Do you think Representative Gonzalez is sanctioned? I know that Representative Blanco, among others, would like to go back and undo parts of SB 4, which I believe all 3 of you in the campaign opposed.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Do you think that we're going to revisit the conversation of sanctuary cities, or is that, along with bathrooms and vouchers, one of those things that we're going to pretend didn't happen last time and not talk about this time, since we're in kumbaya mode?
I know you want us to get out of kumbaya mode.
I do.
Again,
Fact check true.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that we will not, you know, get into those issues that derailed the legislature last session, and we're able to focus on the real issues. Now, whether these issues will come up again?
Yeah.
I mean,
in your heart, you'd like to go
that.
back and undo that, but you're also not thinking it's going to come back up as a topic of conversation.
I don't think so. But you know, if for some reason they do, I mean, we're gonna push back.
You'll be right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Representative Bowers, the highest percentage of the all funds budget for Texas over time has been education until now, where healthcare is basically the same percentage of the all funds budget as education. Mm-hmm. We have spent countless days and weeks and months talking about education, and to my mind, no time talking about healthcare. And yet Texas still has the most uninsured people in the country, and particularly the most uninsured children in the country. After 10 consecutive years of the uninsured children rate in this country going down, it's now gone back up for the last year. We have 835,000 uninsured children. We added more uninsured children last year to the state's rolls, as it were, than we did add children to the public education system. Mm-hmm. Why are we not talking about health care in this legislature? Again, I acknowledge that public education has roadblocked the agenda, but it's the same percentage of the budget as education. Why are we not talking about it?
Well, public education is going to be first and foremost, but we're going to have to talk about it because we talked about it on the campaign trail. I mean, those were, in 113, healthcare rose in 2018 and leveled out with education. Going to the doors in 16, people were more so saying, yes, we've got to look at doing better for our neighborhood schools, but people are hurting out there. And as you said, Evan, Texas is the most and highest uninsured state, and we have to make sure, I do believe we have to look at Medicaid expansion, and we have to really consider as a state why we're still not taking the federal money.
Right. Mr. Talarico, one of the differences between a 95-55 House partisan split and an 83-67 House is that all you need is 9 wayward Republicans, 9 Sarah Davises off the leash. and you all actually have power to do something or to prevent something, do you think that this legislature with a narrower partisan split is possibly open to Medicaid expansion than the previous?
I mean, I haven't gotten any indication of that, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be, like Representative Bowers said.
You're for it as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Ms. Gonzalez, you're for it?
Yes.
Yeah. In the absence of Medicaid expansion, Mr. Talarico, is there anything that you all can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways that we can prevent surprises, especially when you visit the emergency room. There's been efforts to ensure balanced billing after you go to a hospital visit. But the problem, I think, when you talk about the focus on education versus healthcare is that, a lot of, our hands are tied for the most part by federal policy in this area as opposed to education policy. And what I get, but I understand what you're saying, and I think what's sometimes detrimental in this building is when we treat these issue areas as distinct and separate. Whereas in a public school, whether a child has medical care and is healthy, and whether or not our undocumented students are fearful for themselves and their families has a direct impact on public education. I mean, these things are not operating in isolation.
Well, and in fact, to that point, we're talking all this, pardon me, time about property taxes. The reality is one of the drivers of property tax increases in the state is uncompensated care costs being passed along to all of us in the form of people going to the emergency room to be treated for primary care needs. So it is the case that property taxes are going up in part because of that, and if we're going to spend all this time fixing property taxes, one way to do it, Mr. Talarico, might be to fix health care, right?
Right? And that's exactly, I mean, if you talk to any county commissioner in the state, that's exactly what they'll say.
Liberal and conservative county commissioners, right? Both,
That's exactly
both sides. So before we go to the audience with questions, let me start with Ms. Bowers, go down the list here. Ms. Bowers, Ms. Gonzalez, and then Mr. Talarico. What is something we have not talked about today that will be or should be an issue before this legislature? Something we have not talked about that you think is your kind of biggie that you'd like us to be talking about? Ms.
Well,
Bowers.
I think some of the things we're working on, I mean, we've got some legislation that we're going to try to bring forward on child labor laws. I think that we are overworking our students, and I think we have got to look at making sure that they, with an early start day in high school, that they are not having to close. And unfortunately, in the state that we live in the country that we live in, working students are a reality. I think so. Child labor laws, I think some of the committees that I serve on, as you said, Evan, are corrections and juvenile justice and family issues with Representative Talarico. And we just have to look at, we're going to have to look at rehabilitating the incarcerated. We're going to have to look at really fixing the classroom to prison pipeline.
So criminal justice reform is going to be, as it has been at the federal level, it may in fact be bipartisan in the same way that it's been bipartisan at the federal level. And you're on that committee, are you not, Ms. Gonzalez?
Yeah, yes.
So Chair Collier told me that she is prepared to look at everything from issues that have come up previously and have not succeeded, like bail reform, to mandatory minimums, to basically every single way that you can look at welcoming people who have served their time and paid their debt back into society. She's open to considering that, including restoring voting rights for felons.
Yes.
Yeah. What are the issues that you're looking at that we've not talked about today?
Voting rights. I have a long history of protecting the right to vote.
Indeed.
And that's something that I find very important. We need to focus on increasing voter participation versus creating barriers that make it harder for people to get out to vote.
Right.
The only way that we're going to have a democracy that actually works is if we do that. I recently filed, last night I filed 6 elections bills that are common sense. They're common sense fixes that'll just make it easier for.
For instance.
For example, one of the bills was providing for a voter to their first time registering to vote or re-registering to vote, where they can also request a vote by mail ballot in the same form. So that'll have some cost saving
A
effects.
process fix.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Another one would be having joint primaries, which makes it less confusing for voters when they're voting in the primary. And also, I'm trying to think of the other one, but that's going to be one of my main focuses because we saw last session that we lost straight party ticket voting.
Although you guys, let's be honest, Democrats suddenly love straight ticket voting. Right.
And so we're gonna see certain issues that come up in the 2020 election that is gonna have an even bigger turnout. And so some of these fixes are going to be to anticipate some of these issues that we might run into.
But just quickly, don't you think, Representative Gonzalez, people in power hate higher turnout elections.
Yes.
Because who votes in higher turnout elections? People who are pissed off.
Right.
Right? We saw that this last time. I mean, really, it's what motivation do the people in power have to make it possible for more people to vote? As a practical matter, real talk here.
I mean, some of these bills, I mean, do have bipartisan support.
Right.
So, you know, I'm pretty optimistic
You're
that they're gonna make it through.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Talarico, what do you say? What's your big?
I mean, I agree on criminal justice, voting rights, but I'm obsessed with public education. But I would say school safety is an issue that I think. So Rahm
Well,
Emanuel,
the governor made that an emergency
right.
item. Right.
And Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's former chief of staff, said never let a crisis go to waste. And that seems crass, but I think what he means is that you want to channel emergencies into some kind of productive action. And in terms of the school shootings we've seen across the country and in this state, there should be some kind of reaction to that makes our schools safer and healthier. And so, for instance, the first bill we filed yesterday, in fact, is creating a ratio between mental health professionals in schools and law enforcement in schools, and ensuring that if you're going to pursue some of these hardening measures and militarizing our schools and turning them into fortresses, you should be meeting a ratio where you're also adding more social emotional learning and social workers and counselors and mental health professionals. It's founded on the belief that when a child walks to their school, they should see more counselors than cops.
But the governor's emergency item actually does seem to align with you in the sense that it calls out the mental health needs on the school safety stuff specifically. What I've heard some Democrats say is that if we're going to approach school safety and we're not going to talk about guns, this whole thing is phony baloney. What do you think about that?
Oh, I absolutely believe in common sense gun safety, but I'm just saying from an education perspective, this is an opportunity when the nation and the state are paying attention that we can transform the way we treat the whole child in schools. Yeah. Because when I was in the classroom, I often thought that some of the most important things to my students' life outcomes I didn't even talk about. Having healthier relationships with yourself and with other people, how to control your emotions. Right. Those things are in some ways more important than whether or not you memorize the quadratic equation. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for us to kind of shift that focus and that weight in our public schools toward teaching the whole child.
Let's get a couple questions in before we go. Ma'am?
Is anybody in the back room thinking about constitutional reform?
We're fresh, we're not in the back room. So.
Right, but
No
you know who's
us.
in the back room.
You mean constitutional amendments?
Yes.
Yeah, well, we've had constitutional amendments the last couple of sessions, or for a few sessions back, at least on water and transportation. Are you hearing anything about the potential to make those more permanent fixes?
I haven't heard any of anything.
Okay.
No one tells us anything.
Mr. Bonner?
Yeah, vaguely.
No one tells us anything.
What are y'all going to do to stand up to the sort of massive voter suppression efforts that we're seeing from the acting Secretary of State should he make it through his confirmation hearing today?
Ms. Bowers, what about that? This was obviously an issue we at the Tribune were a little bit on top of this issue from a reporting standpoint in questioning what was being alleged and, quite honestly, what was being reported and not even alleged, right? Just the truth of all this. So the governor, it's really interesting to me that I would have predicted at the beginning of the week that they might have pulled the nomination from the nominations committee and let him serve out the session and then roll off, but they said, nope, battle is joined. We're going to go ahead and go forward with the nomination. So what about that?
Well, we know that voter suppression is real, and we are going to have to really stay on top of this, because we know that there are measures being taken to make sure that people, whether they're people of color or the impoverished communities, are not able to get to the polls, not able to vote, and not able to have that basic right.
So how did the allegation that the Secretary of State's office make qualify as voter suppression? Do you think they were trying to scare people into not voting by putting out this list of people who were not all non-citizens?
I do. I think that is a part of voter suppression. I think that it happens around elections, whether it's prior to or after the election, that they want to say that there are people on the rolls or that something fraudulent was done when it comes to voting. I think that is a part of voter suppression. I think it is a scare tactic, and I think that we have to make sure we stand firm to make sure that it is corrected, to make sure that people that have the right to vote are allowed that right.
Right.
So,
Ms. Gonzalez, are you prepared to say that if there's one person voting illegally in the state of Texas, that's bad. Right? This is often the pushback. When people say, well, that list is not a real list, they say, yeah, but even if 80% of the people on that list shouldn't have been on that list, 20% should have been, which means there are still a bunch of people who voted illegally. And shouldn't we take as a principle that even one person voting illegally is too many? Would you agree with that?
You know, at the end of the day, I mean, voter fraud, we really don't see any of that, right? And so, you know, yes, there's going to be inaccuracies on a list. Now, going back through and fixing those, taking folks out if they really don't belong on that list, you know, but not, you know, releasing some list without putting, you know, some kind of due diligence in releasing this list, right? It requires folks to have to call in and, you know, and provide some kind of proof of citizenship. And you know, he's only been there for a couple months, and you know, we've got no answers. We've got no answers as to why this list was released.
You suspect his motives?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Talarico, you too?
And our questions aren't being answered.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there are two threats when these kind of schemes are put forward. One is that you are potentially disenfranchising folks from participating in democracy. The second is you're undermining everyone else's faith in the democratic process, right? If you're kind of pandering to your base and you're telling mostly white folks that there are people participating in the process who shouldn't be, then you are undermining their belief in the democratic process. I mean, it's the same kind of things we've seen from Russia's attempts to interfere in our elections, right? The goal is not necessarily to steal an election. The goal is to make everyone doubt the election. And that's exactly what this attempt did. And I think if it continues, that's the kind of erosion in democratic values you could see. And I mean, democratic values.
But Mr. Talarico, if a clean list had come out, if a list where the homework had been done in advance had come out, and everybody on that list, in fact, had been a non-citizen, and the list of people who, as alleged, had voted at some point in the last 22 years had come out, there were no mistakes on that list.
Sure.
Would you be saying, yeah, voter fraud, we got to get after that?
I think we should try to eliminate any kind of imperfections in our system. I just wish we would have the same worry about, you know, if one person, undocumented person votes, you know, that's unacceptable. If one person doesn't vote because they think they shouldn't when they can, that should be unacceptable too. So I wish there was just concern on both sides of that equation.
Okay, take one more, Charlie, wherever you are. Let's take that just for flavor. Let's take this woman right. Yes.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. This is such a great forum. My name is Dawn Scott, and I'm an adoptive parent who advocates on behalf of another lesser-known minority in our population. 2% are adopted. One of your freshman colleagues, Representative Kalani, is about to file a bill that would support equal rights for adults who were adopted as minors to access their original birth certificates without any different process than a non-adopted person. Do you have an opinion on this, and if so, do you support? And thank you very much.
Any of you have a point of view about that issue?
I mean, I haven't seen the bill, but you know, someone who was also adopted by my father, you know, I think that's something important to look at.
You all will look at it?
I mean, are these folks that are aging out of the system, or what is it that you're
Adults who were adopted as minors. So foster kids age out and get their records.
Mm-hmm.
But any person who was adopted, their record is sealed to them, and they may not even privately access it without a court hearing unless they already knew the names.
Okay. So they're not able to get their, okay.
Essentially for an adult who was adopted.
So you'll look at Representative Kalani's bill?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Of course,
Yes.
good, okay. All right, it's 9. I promised everybody we'd have you out here at 9 o'clock. Let these folks get back up to the Capitol and do their work. Please give them a big hand.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for coming. We'll see you again.
Thank you, Evan.
Great.
Thank you.
Representative, thank you.
Thank you
Enjoyed it.
so very much.